The crystal champagne flute slipped from Sarah Mitchell's fingers, shattering against the polished wooden floor of the Pines Hotel ballroom. The ambient chatter of the engagement party faded to silence as all eyes turned toward the mother of the bride-to-be, but Sarah didn't notice the stares or hear the concerned murmurs. Her entire world had narrowed to a single point across the room, a small crescent-shaped birthmark behind the right ear of James Wilson, her daughter's fiancé. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. A birthmark identical to the one her son Nathan had been born with 30 years ago. A birthmark she hadn't seen since the day a 3-year-old boy vanished from a playground, leaving behind nothing but a half-finished sandcastle and a family destroyed by grief. Sarah, her husband David, gripped her elbow, steadying her as she swayed. "What's wrong?" Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. Across the room, James, handsome, charming James, who had won her daughter's heart 6 months ago, tilted his head back in laughter at something Emily had said, unwittingly revealing the mark once more. Sarah's knees buckled. "It's him," she finally whispered, clutching David's arm with desperate strength. "David, it's Nathan. Our son is alive." The small town of Cedar Grove, Vermont, had rarely seen a celebration like the engagement party of Emily Mitchell and James Wilson. The Mitchell family was a cornerstone of the community. David Mitchell had served as police chief for 15 years before retiring, and Sarah had taught multiple generations of local children during her 30-year career at Cedar Grove Elementary. When their daughter Emily, now a rising star at a Burlington architectural firm, had announced her engagement to James, a medical equipment sales representative she'd met at a healthcare conference, the entire town had rallied to celebrate. The engagement party at the Pines was meant to be the first of many celebrations leading up to the couple's spring wedding. The guest list included nearly 200 people, family, friends, colleagues, and what seemed like half the town. The Mitchells had spared no expense, transforming the hotel's grand ballroom into an elegant wonderland of white roses and twinkling lights. No one looking at Sarah Mitchell that evening would have guessed at the tragedy that had shaped her life 30 years earlier. Dressed in a midnight blue gown that complemented her silver-streaked dark hair, she had spent the evening graciously accepting congratulations and sharing her daughter's happiness. Until that moment, that single, world-tilting moment when James Wilson had laughed, pushed back his fashionably long hair, and inadvertently revealed a secret hidden in plain sight. "Sarah, you need to sit down," David urged, guiding his shaking wife to a nearby chair as guests began to whisper. At 62, David Mitchell still carried himself with the authority of his former position, his broad shoulders and steady presence commanding respect even in retirement. But now, looking into his wife's eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen in decades, the wild, desperate hope that had consumed her during those first terrible months after Nathan disappeared. "The birthmark, David," she whispered urgently. "Behind his ear. It's identical, not similar, identical to Nathan's. The same crescent shape, the same placement." David glanced over at James, who was now looking their way with concern. "Honey, you know birthmarks aren't that uncommon, and after all these years—" "No," Sarah cut him off with unusual vehemence. "You know how distinctive it was. The doctors even remarked on it when he was born, and it's genetic. Your father had it, your brother has it." Emily was making her way toward them now, her face a mixture of concern and embarrassment. At 27, she was the image of Sarah in her youth, tall and graceful, with the same dark eyes and determined chin. She'd been born 2 years after Nathan's disappearance, a new life that had given her parents a reason to continue when grief threatened to consume them. "Mom, what's going on?" Emily asked, kneeling beside her mother's chair. James stood a few paces behind, hesitant to intrude. On the family moment, "Are you feeling ill?" Sarah stared at her daughter. The words caught in her throat. How could she explain? How could she tell this child, who had grown up in the shadow of an absent brother, that the man she planned to marry might be that very brother? "I'm fine," Sarah managed, forcing a smile. "Just feeling a bit overwhelmed. All these people, all this excitement." "Maybe we should call it a night," David suggested, his hand firm on his wife's shoulder. "It's been a long evening." Emily frowned, not entirely convinced, but nodded. "Okay, we can wrap things up. James and I were thinking of heading to the Copper Kettle with some friends for a nightcap anyway." "No!" The word burst from Sarah with surprising force. "I mean, it's your party, sweetheart. You should stay. Your father can take me home." Emily and David exchanged worried glances. "I'll come check on you tomorrow morning," Emily promised, kissing her mother's cheek. "Try to get some rest." As David helped Sarah to her feet, her eyes locked with James's. He smiled politely, that same warm smile that had charmed her from their first meeting. How had she not seen it? The shape of his eyes, so like David's. The way his brow furrowed when he was concerned, a mirror image of her father's expression. "Good night, Mrs. Mitchell," James said, stepping forward. "I hope you feel better soon." Sarah couldn't help herself. She reached out, her fingertips almost grazing the spot where his hair covered the birthmark. "Good night, James," she whispered, her voice breaking on his name. In the car, David waited until they were several blocks from the hotel before speaking. "Sarah, I know what you're thinking, and I need you to slow down." "You saw it, David. You can't tell me you didn't see it." "I saw a birthmark on a young man who happens to be engaged to our daughter. That's all." Sarah turned to face him, her expression fierce. "When was the last time you saw a crescent-shaped birthmark exactly like the one your father had, your brother has, and our son had? In exactly the same place?" David kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "It's been 30 years, Sarah. Nathan would be 33 now. This young man is 33, Sarah finished. "I asked Emily when his birthday was, remember? April 12th. Nathan was born on April 15th. A heavy silence filled the car. "That's a coincidence," David finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. "His mother died 5 years ago. Cancer. He has no other family. Convenient, isn't it? No one to contradict his story." "Sarah," David's voice held a warning note. "You're jumping to conclusions based on a birthmark and a birth date." "I know my son," Sarah insisted as they pulled into the driveway of their colonial-style home on Maple Street. "A mother knows." David turned off the engine, but made no move to get out of the car. "Do you understand what you're suggesting? That Emily, our daughter, is engaged to her brother? Do you realize what that would do to her if you're wrong? And even if by some miracle you're right, do you understand what that would mean for her? For them?" Sarah closed her eyes, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know. God, I know, David. But if there's even a chance, we have to know the truth." Inside their home, Sarah went directly to the room at the end of the hall. They called it the study now, but for the first 5 years after Nathan's disappearance, it had remained exactly as it was the day he vanished, a little boy's bedroom frozen in time. Eventually, as hope faded, they had packed away the toys and small clothes, repainted the walls, and transformed the space. But they had never removed the false bottom in the bottom drawer of the desk. Sarah knelt on the floor and carefully extracted the worn wooden box hidden there. Inside were the precious few items they had preserved from Nathan's short life. The hospital bracelet from his birth, a lock of sandy hair from his first haircut, the tiny tooth that had fallen out just weeks before he disappeared. "We have his DNA," she said, looking up at David, who stood in the doorway, his face shadowed. "We can know for certain." David sank into the desk chair, suddenly looking every one of his 62 years. And then what, Sarah? What if it is him? Emily loves him. They're planning a life together. And what if they have children? Sarah countered, her voice breaking. This isn't just about us anymore, David. If James is Nathan, Emily needs to know before it's too late. David buried his face in his hands. We need to be sure, absolutely sure, before we say anything to anyone. I'll call Frank in the morning, Sarah said, referring to Detective Frank Simmons, David's former partner and still a close family friend. He'll know how to handle this discreetly. David nodded slowly. What about Emily? Sarah clutched the box to her chest. We say nothing until we know. Nothing. Across town, in the warmly lit interior of the Copper Kettle, Emily Mitchell leaned against her fiancé's shoulder, laughing at something one of their friends had said. James had his arm around her, his fingers absently playing with a strand of her dark hair. Your mum seemed pretty upset earlier, he commented during a lull in the conversation. Is she okay? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Emily sighed. I don't know. She's been under a lot of stress with all the wedding planning, and you know how mothers get. Probably just emotional about her only daughter getting married. James nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful. She was looking at me strangely, like she'd seen a ghost. Mum's always been a bit high-strung, Emily explained, choosing her words carefully. She had never fully explained to James the tragedy that had shaped her family before her birth. It wasn't a secret exactly, but it wasn't something the Mitchells discussed openly. There's something I should probably tell you about my family, she began. But just then, their friends returned with another round of drinks, and the moment passed. Emily decided the story of her never-known brother could wait for another day. Tonight was for celebration, not old family tragedies. Detective Frank Simmons had been retired for 5 years, but he still maintained an office in the converted garage of his ranch-style home outside Cedar Grove. When Sarah called at 7, the next morning, he heard the urgency in her voice and told her to come right over. Frank had been a rookie officer when Nathan Mitchell disappeared. He had been the one to take David and Sarah's statement, had coordinated the search parties that combed the woods surrounding the playground, had been the shoulder David leaned on during those terrible days. When no trace of the boy was found, Frank had been the one to gently suggest that they might be dealing with an abduction rather than a lost child. And when the primary suspect, Todd Anderson, a drifter with a history of mental illness who had been seen near the playground that day, was found dead from an apparent suicide a week later, it was Frank who had promised the Mitchells he would never close the case. Sarah and David arrived at Frank's house at 7:30, the wooden box from Nathan's room clutched in Sarah's hands. Frank ushered them into his office, lined with filing cabinets and dominated by a large desk covered in papers, despite his retired status. "Tell me everything," he said, and they did. The birthmark, the approximate age, the lack of family connections, the way James had appeared in Emily's life 6 months ago after meeting at a conference in Manhattan. Frank listened without interrupting, taking careful notes in the same small, precise handwriting he'd used throughout his career. When they finished, he sat back in his chair, tapping his pen against his notepad. "I understand why you're shaken," he said finally. "The birthmark especially. That's a distinctive feature. But Sarah, David, you need to consider the statistical likelihood here. The chances of your son not only surviving an abduction, but then randomly meeting and falling in love with his own sister 30 years later. It's impossible," Sarah interrupted. "I know how it sounds, Frank, but what if it's not random? What if on some subconscious level he was drawn to his family? There are studies about genetic attraction, about siblings separated at birth who find each other later in life. Frank looked to David, who spread his hands helplessly. "I know it's a long shot," David admitted. "But if there's even a chance..." "We need to know," Sarah finished. "One way or another, we need to know." Frank nodded slowly. "Okay, I still have contacts at the state lab. We can run a DNA test without raising flags. But I need to be clear about something. This stays between us until we have definitive results. You don't confront this young man. You don't hint to Emily. You don't start digging into his background yourselves. Understood?" Both Mitchells nodded solemnly. "I'll need something with his DNA," Frank continued. "Hair with the follicle intact, a toothbrush, something like that, and I'll need samples from both of you for comparison." "How do we get his DNA without telling him?" David asked. Frank thought for a moment. "Does he ever stay at your house? Use a guest bathroom, maybe?" Sarah nodded. "They're coming for dinner tomorrow night. It's a standing arrangement, every Sunday." "Good. After dinner, offer him a toothbrush if he doesn't have one. Tell him you keep extras for guests. Let him use it, then bag it after he leaves. I can work with that." The plan set, Sarah and David prepared to leave, but Frank stopped them at the door. "One more thing," he said, his expression grave. "Have you considered what happens if you're right? Not just to Emily and James, but to the case? If this is Nathan, then someone abducted him, changed his identity, and raised him as their own. That's a federal crime. This could become much bigger than just your family." Sarah's jaw set in a determined line. "If someone stole our son, they deserve whatever comes to them. Even if that someone is already dead?" Frank asked quietly. "Even if opening this up causes your son and your daughter immeasurable pain?" David placed a steadying hand on his wife's shoulder. "We'll cross that bridge if we come to it," he said. "For now, let's just find out the truth." As they drove home, Sarah stared out the window at the familiar streets of Cedar Grove, seeing instead the past 3 decades of her life. The endless searching, the gradual acceptance, the effort to build a new normal around the gaping hole left by Nathan's absence. And now, the possibility that he had been alive all this time, growing up with another family, unaware of his true identity, only to circle back to the very people he had been taken from. "What are you thinking?" David asked softly. "I'm thinking about the day we met James," Sarah replied. "Remember how comfortable he seemed in our house? How he knew exactly where the extra napkins were kept when Emily was in the other room? At the time, I thought Emily had shown him around, but she said later she hadn't. What if on some level, he remembered?" David reached across the console to take her hand. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. We need proof before we start reconstructing memories." Sarah squeezed his fingers. "I know, but David, I felt it. When I looked into his eyes last night, I felt the connection. A mother knows her child." The Sunday dinner the following evening was an exercise in restraint. Sarah had to force herself not to stare at James, not to search his face for familiar features, not to ask the 100 questions burning on her tongue. She busied herself with the meal: pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans with almonds, and apple pie for dessert. All foods James had complimented on previous visits. Emily, still concerned about her mother's episode at the engagement party, watched Sarah with worried eyes. "Mom, are you sure you're feeling okay? We could have rescheduled if you needed to rest." "I'm perfectly fine," Sarah assured her, setting the gravy boat on the table with steady hands. "Just a little moment of vertigo the other night, nothing to worry about." Throughout dinner, David maintained a stream of conversation, asking James about his work, discussing an upcoming fishing trip they had planned, carefully keeping the interaction normal while Sarah observed silently. Every gesture, every expression James made seemed to resonate with forgotten memories. The way he cut his meat into precise pieces before eating, the slight furrow between his brows when he concentrated, even the way he held his fork, tines, down, European style, just as they had taught Nathan all those years ago. After dessert, Emily insisted on clearing the table while Sarah made coffee. "James, could you help Dad move that new bookshelf into the guest room?" she asked. "He's been putting it off for weeks." As the men left the dining room, Sarah leaned against the kitchen counter, her heart racing. This was the opportunity they had been waiting for. The guest bathroom upstairs had fresh towels and a new toothbrush still in its packaging, strategically placed where James would see it if he wanted to wash up after moving furniture. 20 minutes later, her careful planning paid off. From her position in the kitchen, she heard the distinctive sound of the upstairs bathroom door closing. She waited, counting the minutes, until she heard the door open again and footsteps on the stairs. James appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hair slightly damp at the temples. "Bookshelf mission accomplished," he announced with a smile, "though I think your husband could have handled it himself. The man is stronger than he looks." Sarah returned his smile, her heart hammering against her ribs. "He insists he's still 45. His back disagrees." She poured him a cup of coffee. "Did you find everything you needed upstairs?" James nodded, accepting the cup. "Yes, thank you. Hope it was okay that I used one of the new toothbrushes. I had garlic bread at lunch and I've been self-conscious about my breath all day." "Of course," Sarah managed, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the sugar bowl. "That's what they're there for." 3 days after the engagement party, Frank Simmons called the Mitchells. His voice was grave when David answered. "You need to come to my office, both of you." They arrived within the hour, finding Frank standing in his driveway waiting for them. His weathered face revealed nothing as he led them inside. Once seated, in his office, Frank placed a manila folder on the desk between them. "The DNA test results came back this morning," he said quietly. "I had them rush it through as a favor." Sarah reached for the folder with trembling hands, but Frank placed his palm over it, stopping her. "Before you look at this, I want to make sure you're prepared for either outcome. If it's negative, you need to let this go, completely, for Emily's sake." "And if it's positive?" David asked, his voice barely audible. "If it's positive, we're dealing with a 30-year-old kidnapping case, and your daughter is engaged to her biological brother." Frank's directness was both brutal and necessary. "Are you prepared for what that means for your family?" Sarah nodded, her face pale but resolute. "We need to know." Frank removed his hand from the folder. Sarah opened it, her eyes scanning. The document inside, the clinical language swam before her eyes until she found the conclusion statement bold and unambiguous. "The probability of paternity is 99.9998%. "It's him," she whispered, passing the paper to David. "It's Nathan." David read the results, then covered his face with his hands. "Dear God." Frank leaned forward. "I've already started a quiet investigation into James Wilson's background. His mother, Linda Wilson, moved to Tacoma from here in Cedar Grove 30 years ago. Before that, she worked at Cedar Grove Memorial as a nurse's aide, the same hospital where Nathan was born." "Did she know us?" Sarah asked. "No direct connection. Yet, but I found something else. Linda Wilson's cousin was Todd Anderson." Sarah gasped. Todd Anderson, the drifter suspected in Nathan's disappearance, who had committed suicide a week later. "The theory we had 30 years ago was partially right," Frank continued. "Todd likely took Nathan from the playground, but instead of harming him, he gave the boy to his cousin Linda, who then moved across the country and raised him as her own." "But why?" David asked. "What possible motive would they have had?" Frank opened another folder. Todd Anderson had a history of mental illness. He'd been institutionalized twice for paranoid delusions. And Linda. He hesitated. Linda had lost a child 6 months before Nathan's disappearance. A 3-year-old boy, James Wilson Jr., who drowned in a boating accident. Her husband left her shortly after. Sarah pressed her hand to her mouth. She stole our son to replace her own. It looks that way, Frank confirmed. She created a new birth certificate using her dead son's name, but changing the birth date slightly. Then moved to Washington State where no one knew her. And Todd killed himself out of guilt, David murmured. Most likely, we'll never know for certain. Sarah stared at the DNA results, reality settling in. What do we do now, Frank? How do we tell them? Frank sighed heavily. That's not an easy question. This isn't just a family reunion anymore. It's a criminal case, even if the primary suspects are deceased. Once I officially reopen the investigation, this becomes public record. We need to tell them privately, David insisted, before this gets out. I agree, Frank said, but how you tell them matters. This isn't just about reuniting with your son, Sarah. It's about telling two people in love that they're siblings. The weight of that truth hung in the air between them. The miracle they had prayed for had arrived twisted into a nightmare. I'll schedule a meeting, Frank decided. My office, tomorrow morning. I'll ask both Emily and James to come in regarding a routine background check for James's hunting license application. It was a flimsy excuse, but it would get them both here. Then we tell them together, gently. The next morning, Emily and James arrived at Frank's home office, puzzled by the summons, but unconcerned. Sarah and David were already there, seated on a small sofa against the wall. Mom, Dad, what are you doing here? Emily asked, confusion evident in her voice. Frank gestured for the young couple to sit in the chairs opposite his desk. Thank you both for coming. I'm afraid I wasn't entirely truthful about why I asked you here. James tensed visibly. Is everything all right? Frank looked at Sarah and David, giving them the opportunity to begin. Sarah nodded and moved to sit beside Emily, taking her daughter's hand. Sweetheart, there's something we need to tell you, both of you. Her voice shook slightly. It's about your brother, Nathan. Emily frowned. Nathan? Why are you bringing him up now? James looked between them, clearly confused. I'm sorry, who's Nathan? David cleared his throat. Nathan was our son, Emily's brother. He disappeared 30 years ago when he was 3 years old. He was taken from a playground here in Cedar Grove. We never found him. James's expression softened with sympathy. I'm so sorry. Emily mentioned she had a brother who died young, but she never told me the circumstances. He didn't die, Sarah said quietly. He was kidnapped, and we know. She faltered, looking to Frank for help. Frank took over, his tone professional but gentle. James, at the engagement party, Mrs. Mitchell noticed you have a distinctive birthmark behind your right ear. A crescent-shaped mark in a very specific position. James's hand automatically went to the spot, covered by his hair. Yes, I've had it since birth. What does that have to do with anything? Nathan had an identical birthmark, David explained. It's a genetic trait that runs in our family. My father had it, my brother has it. James stared at them, the beginnings of understanding dawning in his eyes. What are you saying? Frank placed the DNA test results on the desk. We ran a DNA comparison, James. The results conclusively show that you are Nathan Mitchell, David, and Sarah's biological son. The room fell silent. Emily's face drained of color as she withdrew her hand from her mother's. James remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable. That's impossible, he finally whispered. My mother was Linda Wilson. I was born in Tacoma. Linda Wilson moved to Tacoma from Cedar Grove 30 years ago, Frank said gently. Shortly after Nathan Mitchell disappeared, her cousin, Todd Anderson, was the primary suspect in the kidnapping. No, James shook his head vehemently. No, this is some kind of mistake. My mother wouldn't, she couldn't. She lost her own son, Sarah said softly. A little boy also named James. He drowned. She was grieving, desperate. Emily suddenly stood, backing away from all of them. Stop it, she demanded, her voice rising. Stop this right now. This is insane. Emily, David began, reaching for her. No. She recoiled from his touch. You're telling me that James, my fiancé, is actually my brother. The brother I've heard about my entire life. Do you have any idea how crazy that sounds? Frank pushed the DNA results toward her. I'm afraid it's true, Emily. The test is conclusive. James took the paper with shaking hands, scanning the results. His face went ashen. This can't be real, he murmured. My entire life. Emily turned on her parents, fury and devastation warring in her expression. How long have you suspected this? When did you take his DNA? Did you go through his things while he was at our house? We had to know, Sarah pleaded. Sweetheart. Try to understand. Understand? Emily's laugh was bitter and broken. Understand that you've been investigating the man I love? That the life I've been planning is... She couldn't finish, collapsing back into her chair as the full implications hit her. James stood abruptly. I need air, he muttered, stumbling toward the door. James, wait, Sarah called, rising to follow him. Don't call me that, he snapped, whirling to face her. That's not even my real name, is it? My whole life is a lie. The woman I thought was my mother was actually my kidnapper. And the woman I love is... He broke off, unable to speak the truth aloud. I can't be here right now. He yanked open the door and disappeared outside. After a moment's hesitation, David followed him. He found James sitting on the front steps, head in his hands. David sat beside him, maintaining a respectful distance. I know there's nothing I can say that will make this easier, David began. She was a good mother, James said, his voice muffled. Linda, she loved me. She took care of me. How could she have done something so horrible? David sighed heavily. Sometimes good people do terrible things, especially when they're in pain. It doesn't excuse what she did. Taking you from us broke our hearts. But I believe she loved you in her way. James looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. All these years, I thought I was alone in the world after she died. And now you're telling me I had a family all along. A family I found without even knowing I was looking for them. He laughed bitterly. And I fell in love with my sister. How's that for cosmic irony? Inside the office, Emily was demanding answers from Frank, her initial shock hardening into anger. What happens now? Is this a criminal investigation? Will it be public? Frank nodded reluctantly. I have to reopen the case officially. There's no statute of limitations on kidnapping, though with both Linda Wilson and Todd Anderson deceased, there won't be a trial. So everyone will know, Emily said flatly. The whole town will know that I was engaged to my brother. We can try to keep certain details private, Frank offered. But Emily wasn't listening. She turned to her mother. Did you ever think about what this would do to us, to me and James? Or were you only thinking about getting your son back? Emily. Sarah reached for her daughter's hand, but Emily pulled away. Of course we thought about you. We agonized over it. But we couldn't let you marry your brother, no matter how much it might hurt you both now. Emily's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her. I love him, Mom, she whispered. What am I supposed to do with that now? Outside, David and James sat in silence until the front door opened again. Sarah appeared, her face tear-streaked but composed. Nathan, she said hesitantly. James flinched at the name. "Please don't call me that yet. I'm still trying to process who I am." Sarah nodded, understanding. "May I sit with you?" He nodded, and she settled on his other side, completing their strange family tableau. For a long moment, none of them spoke. "I remember your voice," James finally said, almost inaudibly. "I used to have dreams about a woman singing to me, not Linda, someone else. She sang a lullaby about a little sailboat." Sarah's breath caught. "Little boat on the sea. I sang it to you every night." James closed his eyes, years of fractured memories shifting into new patterns. "I always felt like something was missing in my life. Even with Linda, Mom, I felt this emptiness. When I met Emily, something clicked into place. I thought it was just love." His voice broke on the word. "But it was family I was recognizing." The door opened again, and Emily emerged. Her eyes were red from crying, but her expression was determined. She looked at James, sitting between her parents, and the visual representation of their new reality was stark. "I need to leave Cedar Grove for a while," she announced. "I've called Beth in Burlington. I'm going to stay with her until I figure things out." "Emily," James began, rising to his feet. She held up a hand, stopping him. "Don't, please. I can't talk to you right now. I can't look at you and see." She trailed off, unable to articulate the tangle of emotions. "I just need time." "We all do," David said quietly. 6 months passed. Cedar Grove weathered the scandal with surprising compassion, rallying around the Mitchell family in their strange grief and joy. James, who decided to keep his name rather than reclaim Nathan, moved into an apartment in Burlington and began the slow process of reconnecting with his biological parents while building a new identity for himself. Emily took a position with an architectural firm in Boston, maintaining minimal contact with her family as she worked through her feelings with a therapist who specialized in trauma and loss. On a crisp autumn day, exactly 30 years and 6 months after Nathan Mitchell disappeared from Lakeside Park, the Mitchell family gathered at the very same playground. Sarah, David, James, and, to everyone's surprise and relief, Emily. It was the first time all four had been together since that terrible day in Frank's office. Emily had finally agreed to return for the small private ceremony Sarah had proposed, a formal closing of the missing persons case and a celebration of the reunited family, however complicated. Frank Simmons was there too, holding a folder containing the official case closure documents. The investigation had confirmed their initial findings. Todd Anderson, in the grip of paranoid delusions, had taken Nathan from the playground and delivered him to his cousin Linda, who had been desperate to replace her own lost son. She had created a new identity for Nathan and fled across the country, where she raised him as James Wilson, never telling him the truth about his origins. The case had made national news briefly, the sensational angle of siblings, unknowingly, falling in love, competing with the miracle of a family reunited after 3 decades. But media interest had faded, allowing the Mitchells to begin healing in private. Emily stood slightly apart from the others, still uncomfortable with the new family dynamic. But she had come. That was progress enough for now. 30 years ago today, Sarah began, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her eyes. Our family was torn apart on this playground. Today, we come together to mark the official end of Nathan Mitchell's missing person case. She turned to James with a smile. Though Nathan has chosen to continue his life as James Wilson, he is and will always be our son. James nodded, still finding it surreal to hear himself referred to as both people, the lost boy and the man he had become. Frank handed the case unfiled to David, who placed it in a small metal box they had brought for the occasion. Case number 957481, the disappearance of Nathan David Mitchell, is officially closed, Frank announced. David added a photograph to the box, a recent picture of the four of them taken awkwardly at Frank's insistence before today's ceremony. Next to it, he placed the faded photograph of 3-year-old Nathan that had been on missing person posters 3 decades earlier. "We're burying the case," Sarah explained, "but not the memory, not the connection that remained even when we didn't know it existed." James stepped forward, adding his own contribution to the box, Linda Wilson's locket, containing a tiny photograph of the original James, her son who had drowned. "She loved me," he said simply. "In her way, broken as it was, I'm learning to hold both truths at once." They looked to Emily, who hesitated before approaching. From her purse, she withdrew a small, worn stuffed rabbit. "You left this at my apartment," she said to James, not quite meeting his eyes. "The night before. Before we found out, I kept it. I don't know why." James recognized the toy he'd had since childhood. "Mr. Flopsy," he said with a sad smile. "Linda, Mom, told me he was the first gift she ever gave me." "Actually," Sarah said softly, "I bought that for your first birthday. You never went anywhere without it." The simple stuffed toy became a potent symbol of their tangled history, the one constant that had traveled with James from one life to the next. Emily placed it gently in the box. David closed the lid and handed a small garden trowel to James, who knelt and began digging a shallow hole beneath the old oak tree that had shaded the playground for generations. Together, the four of them buried the box in a silent ceremony of closure. As they stood in a loose circle afterward, Emily finally spoke directly to James. "I'm seeing someone," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "A lawyer I met in Boston. It's new." James nodded. "I'm glad, Em." "And you?" she asked, the old nickname slipping out before she could catch herself. "Taking it day by day," he replied. "Getting to know my parents, working with a therapist, figuring out who James Wilson is now that I know about Nathan Mitchell. I've been thinking," Emily said hesitantly, "that maybe someday we could try to be friends, siblings even. Not right away, but eventually." It was the first time she had acknowledged the possibility of any relationship between them, and James felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. "I'd like that," he said simply. Sarah and David exchanged a glance, a silent communication born of 40 years together and weathering the unimaginable. They had lost their son and found him again in the most complicated way possible. They had nearly lost their daughter in the process. But here, on the same ground where tragedy had struck 30 years ago, something new was beginning to grow. "Let's go home," Sarah suggested, including all of them in the invitation. "I made lunch." As they walked away from the playground, Emily fell into step beside James, maintaining a careful distance but no longer avoiding his presence. Sarah and David followed a few paces behind, allowing their children the space to begin navigating their new relationship. "Do you think they'll be okay?" Sarah whispered to David. He watched as Emily said something that made James laugh. A tentative but genuine moment of connection. "Not today," he answered honestly. "Maybe not tomorrow, but someday. They're both Mitchells after all, stubborn as hell and stronger than they know." Sarah slipped her hand into his, and together they followed their children home. A family, fractured and rebuilt, forever changed but finally complete. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.